First of all, welcome to tonight's Voices for Scotland in Conversation event. We're very, very honoured to be joined by Sir Geoff Palmer tonight, and I'm actually really excited. For those of you who haven't used Zoom before, you can change the way that you view us by clicking on the top right corner. There's a wee button called View, where you can change the way that you're seeing who's speaking, so you can choose between speaker or gallery view, which might come in handy later. You're also able to change your name if you click on the attendee or participants button in the bottom line. So you can change your name, and you can, if you have any questions, as I said, we will have a Q&A session later on, but you can always pop your questions into the chat. If you'd like to change your name in the participants, you can also add your location if you like, just to know a bit more where everyone's from. But yeah, okay. So just gonna say welcome again to everyone who's just joined us now. I think we can probably start now. I am super excited to introduce Sir Geoff Palmer tonight. As I said before, I'm actually really, really excited to have you here tonight, and we're very honored that you have taken your evening to share it with us. I know you're very, very busy and just came off a council meeting, and so yeah, much appreciated. Let me just check if we've got anything else. Yeah. Just checking, waiting for any more. Yeah, so we're Voices for Scotland. We're a small organisation campaigning for Scottish independence, and what we've been doing over the last few months is we've been trying to have different conversations, different input into our weekly conversations by having these get-togethers and in-conversation events. So if you haven't been here before, it's great you're joining us, and if you've been here before, thanks for coming again. As I said, we're super excited to have Sir Geoff Palmer tonight, who's not just a emeritus life science professor at Heriot-Watt University, but most importantly, a human rights activist and someone who has been very prominent recently. I've got so much respect for you and the work that you're doing, and I just think it's fantastic to have you tonight. When I asked you earlier on the week to give us a bit of an input of what you will speak about, you said that we cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences of the past, such as racism, for the better. And I think that is just such a positive view of looking at what we will talk about. And I think also a really important view that we learn more about the past, especially the bits that are left off the curriculum, but still have formed the nation so far. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And, you know, I live in a little village called Pennycook, which is high up in the hills in the Pentland, and talking to people who live in different parts of Scotland, in fact, all over the world, is just really fascinating for me. And because I see, you know, I will tell you my connections with Scotland. So during my talk, you'll be thinking about it. I had my DNA done, and my wife brought in the results in this room in which I'm sitting, and she said, "Your DNA results are here." And I said, "What does it say?" And she said, "You're 80% Nigerian, 5% Cameroon, 5% Kenyan," and it went to 97%. And she stopped, and I said, "Well, what's the remaining 3%?" And she said it was Viking from Shetland. And then she smiled and said, "It explains a lot." So again, I've been talking about Scottish connections for years, you know, before 2007. And I now realize that I have not just a heritage or a cultural historical connection. Mm-hmm. I have a genetic connection. And a lot of Caribbean people, they have that connection. And when we were talking about an event in Scotland some time ago about the Scottish diaspora, you know, there was a picture in the newspaper And it was about the diaspora was just a whole load of white men, mainly in kilts. And I wrote to the newspaper and said, well, Scotland as a diaspora, and a significant part of it isn't white. And they changed the photograph and inserted an Asian young man reading Burns. So again, you know, we have this response to our history where people are not really fully aware of the significance of this history, that in fact, you know, little mistakes like that are made. But we hope that, you know, with the work we're doing and you're doing, that we will change that in order that people can realize, and this is the essence of what I'm going to talk about, we're one humanity, nothing less. And the differences between us, in fact, I made a video for the Scottish government, I think it was last year, and it was called We Are Scotland. And that is my view, that everybody living here is part of the citizenship of this country, and that we're incumbent to do all we can for it. I said before, that got me into some trouble when I said, you know, that the people of Scotland should decide their future. And of course, I got other people from all different political parties, some applauding me and others didn't like it very much. But I only said something that applies to most countries in the world. Now, in terms of my historical connection with Scotland, you know, my genetics, my DNA says I'm of African origin. And my ancestors were taken from Africa during slavery. But somehow my genetics is telling you that. So my ancestors have not gone back to Nigeria or Africa to live over the last 250 years, but my genetics tells me that my ancestors were taken from Africa and they stayed in Jamaica all that time. And I'm the product of that long history. Now, Scotland was involved in that history. And in that history, sadly, is called chattel slavery. And we must recognize the difference between, and I had it today, we had a meeting earlier with another council, not Edinburgh. And, you know, one of the speakers said, yes, you know, Scotland was involved in slavery, but, you know, we had slaves in Scotland, you know, miners or salters. And I didn't want to, you know, have an argument, but the point there is that a chattel slave, and this is where we must begin, a chattel slave, a British chattel slave, had no right to life. A British chattel slave was property. And that's why in 1833-34, when the slaves were emancipated, the slave owners got about 20 million for their property. They were entitled to it. That's what the law said. And that entitlement did not apply to slaves in any way. They didn't get a penny. So Scotland slave owners received compensation. And we can check that, it's easy because it's on the slave compensation list, of which I've got a copy in this room. And the largest recipient of slave money or money for compensation for slaves was received by Sir John Gladstone. And many of you are listening are in walking distance of where he was born, because he was born in Leith. And he went into the slave business. And as I said, and his son, he's the father of the famous William Gladstone. But he received about 80 million in today's money for his 2,508 slaves. 2,508. And he had slave plantations in Guyana, British Guyana it was then, and Jamaica. We also have, if we're going to look at it in contrast, you know, we have the politician, Henry Dundas, and I've been struggling, as you know, to get an appropriate plaque placed on his statue in St. Andrew's Square. And he was a politician that stopped William Wilberforce abolishing the slave trade and others for 15 years, from 1792 to 1807. And he was impeached in 1806. He's the last British politician to be impeached for taking Navy's money. He was impeached in 1806, and the slave trade was abolished in 1807. The academics will say, oh, it was the French Revolution, and it was towards the end of the French Revolution, and that's why slavery was abolished. Historical facts are that he was impeached in 1806, and the slave trade was abolished in 1807. Some people said, well, the House of Lords let him off, so he wasn't guilty. The point is he had to resign from the government and also as a member of the Privy Council. So it was a serious act. Now, Scotland's involvement is what I summed it up and said, you know, Scotland owned 30% of the slave plantations, a total in the Caribbean, and owned over 30% of the slaves. And if you look through in 2007 to try to get an idea of that, a relationship, you know, I'm a bit of a scientist, so I did a bit of lateral thinking. And then I sent off for a Jamaica telephone directory. I don't know why I did it, but I did. And when it arrived, I looked at it and was surprised by the names in it. Over 60% of the names in the Jamaica telephone directory are Scottish. My mother's name is Lamond. My cousins are Moats, Woods, I can't even remember some of the others. Gladstone, there's also a Gladstone Wood in my family. So we have a link there through names, which are not African, but these names were taken from probably slave plantation owners. And my family still live on, my mother's family, my mother's side, still live on a plantation in Jamaica called Marshall's Pen. And Marshall Pen as a slave plantation was very large, you know, over 900 acres. But my family live on a small few acres still. But it is called Marshall Pen. And the entire plantation, it was also called Marshall Pen, and it was owned by Lord Balcarras. You know, there's a Balcarras Street in Edinburgh and a Balcarras Court, I think. And Lord Balcarras was Henry Dundas's governor in Jamaica between 1794 and 1801. He was the governor, and he became a notorious slave owner. His wife lived on George Street. She had 2 houses there. I think one was the Laura Ashley building. And he has a great estate, the family still has it, in Fife. So here is my family living on Marshall's Pen, and I'm doing now a lot of work in the relationship between Henry Dundas and Balcarras. So that's how close the history is. It's in touching distance for some of us. Now, that is Scotland's link in a small nutshell of the relationship between Scotland, Africa, and the present descendants' heritage. Now, if we look at, you know, how can we bring about any change? And we're talking about change, I'll focus on how Black people are seen. And Black people are seen in many ways as David Hume from Edinburgh described them in about the 1750s. You know, he got up one morning and he said, in his view, non-white people are inferior to white people. And he's especially focused on Negroes. And of course, Kant, the philosopher, picked that up and changed it into race. That's how race came about as an academic concept. And of course, the slave owners picked that up and said it was a justification for enslaving Black people as slaves in the Caribbean. So we have that concept and it still persists. And I'll tell you a couple of stories that last year I went to give a talk at the Edinburgh Festival. And when I arrived at St. Andrew's Church, the attendant there said, you know, can I help you? And I said, yes, I've come to give a talk. And she said, looking at the list, she said, no, you can't be giving a talk at 2 o'clock because that talk is being given by Professor Sir Geoff Palmer. And only a few days ago, I went to another organization and I phoned in, as you have to now, and the person on the phone said, what's your name and what's your age? And I gave both. And I was told to come in, but when I got to the glass door, the young lady saw me and she said, you cannot come in here without an appointment. Would you please go away and make an appointment? And I said to her, well, I am Palmer, you know, who you just spoke to on the phone. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, I'm Palmer. Because on the list she's got, I'm down there as Sir Geoff Palmer. So again, we have a situation, and it's not these people's fault. It is the way they were educated. And it is that miseducation, as we would like to call it, that has caused the problems that we have today. It is that attitude from David Hume that killed George Floyd. And you may think, God, that's an extreme. No, it isn't. It is the policeman inherently believe that the person who's kneeling on was inferior to him, had not contributed much to the society, and therefore he wouldn't be reprimanded, you know, for it. Not even his colleagues standing next to him thought it was wrong. And I'm speaking to you today is because of that sad incident. The world saw how Black people were perceived and treated. You know, there have been killings before, but nobody has witnessed it over nearly 9 minutes. And I think that we have a lot to do in order to change that, and it can be changed. As I've said, we can change the consequences of the past, but we can't change the past. So it's no point somebody saying to me, but that was the past. No, the past has consequences. And one of the sad points is that we sometimes have academics, historians, and we're in the middle of that battle at the moment where, you know, I've managed to get Edinburgh Council with other people's help on a committee to discuss the changing Henry Dundas's plaque, to say that with one word, he gradually abolished the slave trade. And during that period of gradual abolition over 15 years, about 630,000 Africans were transported into slavery on the basis of one word, gradual. And all the politicians at that time knew. They knew that, in fact, gradual meant never. The Prime Minister Pitt says it. I've got a plaque in my room here where the quoting Pitt at the time, and he said, it was gradual meant waiting for a contingency, refusing to act until 1,000 favorable circumstances unite. That was what Pitt said, and that meant never. And therefore, we still have academics today saying Dundas was an abolitionist, when one of his greatest slave-owning friends and associates who got us help, the slave owners. What, in fact, James Bailey, MP for Horsham, said, that abolitionists were low men. In fact, the full quote is, abolitionists were, ignorant low men. And therefore, he couldn't be referring to Dundas in any way. So we have a definition of an abolitionist coming from a slave owner. So academics, we must get them to stop manipulating the truth, because the Scottish people can take their own history. They can take the good and the bad of it. They don't need historians to moderate it and manipulate it for them. And many places I've gone in Scotland, from the north to the south, to the east to the west, and I've given lectures since 2007, since the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade. And the consistent response has been, why hasn't anybody told us this truth before? And the point is, what they're saying, they've never heard of Dundas and his role in the slave. They've never heard of Gladstone and his slave ownership. They've never heard that the Grants of Speyside or the Sterlings of Kerr and all these other people were involved in slavery to a great, they've never heard of the Weatherburns, they've never heard of Oswald, they've never heard of Auchencrew House, which I visited. They've never heard of the stained glass window in the cathedral and the necropolis, which is built by a slave owner, and the Gallery of Modern Art, which is a slave master's house. And a significant number of the houses in the new town are built or bought with slave money. I looked at one the other day, which was about £1,000 before slavery was abolished. Today, it's 2.78 million in the new town. The point is that history cannot be changed. And if you did not know what I'm saying now, then in fact, you've been shortchanged on your education. And people like, whether it's Michael Fry or Tom Devine, and the other historians, Professor Cairns, all these people have been involved, and you now have Tom Devine writing that slave owners and Dundas were working together in his book, in one of his books. And recently in the, I think it's Herald on Sunday, you may have seen it. The journalist, I think is Kevin McKennan, who actually wrote an article quoting Tom Devine regarding Edinburgh Council as a kangaroo court because they put the truth on Henry Dundas's plaque. The point is that the journalist, referred to me as a chemist and as somebody working with the council, which is not true. And then in the same breath, he describes Sir Tom Devine as a historian of very high standing and also of a particular chair in history. And what he's doing at a stroke was the readers who were reading that would see me as not being qualified, not being able to say anything to the council, whereas Sir Tom Devine is perfectly highly qualified to do so. And that is not true. And thank goodness, one of the vice principals of the Edinburgh University, James Smith, actually put on Twitter, and it was so good to see that, because what we're lacking are people in authority to speak out for people who don't have the capacity or the chance to speak up for themselves. And what he said, that myself and Tom Devine were equally qualified, we're both emeritus professors of respective universities. He also said that the chair, this great chair of history, is a myth. And he also refers to the newspaper article as biased. in its representation. And this is 2020, last week. Mm-hmm. Now, why is that necessary? The point is that buried in our subconscious is this slavery. And therefore, it must change. Because that article, people may smile, but if that were in the United States, somewhere in the south of the United States, somebody could have done me a lot of harm. Mm. And I've done nothing other than try to say, from what I've read and what research I've done, this is the situation. I try to make it evidence-based. Now, you know, how can we, you know, within a diverse society, make it diverse management? Because a diverse society without a diverse management is going to be inefficient. We have people of different cultures, different attitudes, different behaviors, and we need to know how to manage that and to get the full potential out of people. You know, I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm a black boy brought up in a tough part of Kingston. I've lived in London, I've lived in Haringey, and you know, I've managed to get through the educational system with a lot of help from a lot of people. And when Guinness wanted an expert to go to Nigeria to help them look at their brewing difficulties, they didn't ask about color. They picked the person which was at the best capacity to solve the problem. And that's what we should be doing. A lot of my students are doing very well in Scotland. They're part of Scotland's economy. And I won't call any names, but some of the most successful craft brewers in Scotland and in the world are my students. And therefore, that's what we need. We don't want this picking and choosing based on a pigment. So as far as I'm concerned, and I'll stop because I don't want to keep you too long, that Scotland has had that relationship and link with slavery. You know, but the point is that when we understand that, there are good people out there, and we don't want the historians making excuses for them. They don't want that. They wouldn't want a Joseph Knight case, which abolished slavery, that people are told. And therefore, that gives you an excuse. You know, it balances. You've abolished slavery, so therefore you are involved in slavery, so that in fact balances. It's a nonsense. Evil is evil. It can't be balanced. It can be adjusted and changed for the better. And therefore, this nonsense about the Joseph Knight case, you know, Scotland abolishing slavery before British slavery was abolished, is just nonsense. Because I've said to the people involved, define Joseph Knight slavery. I've defined chattel slavery. It's a black person that had no right to life and was property. Joseph Knight was a servant, and therefore you cannot abolish slavery with a servant. But finally, what I would like to say, you know, irrespective of what I've said, the most important thing, what I've said this evening, is the professor from Edinburgh University who actually called out the attack of which the Herald on Sunday and Kevin McKenna leveled at me. And that's one of the most significant aspects that we can do to stop racism, is to call it out, whether it's your friend, your family or associate, or when you're at work. And finally, you know, my experience has told me that we're all one humanity, nothing less. And that's what we should recognize as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all your experience and insights here. It's just, I've seen you speak before, and I'm always, yeah, I think it just really, everything you say, it stays with me after the conversation, because it is such an interesting insight that I won't have. You know, the experiences you live, other people won't have. And I think it's really important that we make sure that more and more people learn about it. So as we're just moving on to the Q&A session of tonight, we're currently moving everyone over to panelists, which means we'll ask you to turn on your camera, so you will all get a chance, maybe not all of you because you're quite a lot, but you will get a chance to ask questions now. Just bear with me for one moment. So yeah, my colleague Alan is just turning you over into panelists. In the meantime, if you'd like to write into the chat from where you're joining us tonight and whether you have any questions, just go on. Professor Palmer, there was so much in what you were saying about why it's still important to talk about the past and learn about the past. I'm from Germany, so I grew up in school with constantly learning about the Holocaust, about the Nazis, about all the horrible, horrible crimes that were done during that time. And we did it in school over and over again. And to the point where I was like, can we just like learn about the Egyptians for one point? You know, we've heard it. But I was really, really surprised when I came here that there isn't an equivalent about the empire and slavery in the current school curriculum.
Yeah.
Why do you think it still is in 2020 that we haven't included that now? And also, what impact do you think it has on young people and also on young Black children to know that this has happened, but it's not actually part of the collective education system?
Well, it is, you know, one of these things that has surprised a lot of people. But in fact, I've spoken to some teachers, and I've discussed it with a lot of people. And one of the view, and it's not only in Scotland, the view was, well, we don't want to teach that horrible history to children. It will affect their well-being, and therefore it isn't taught because people feel that their history is not, you know, it's not acceptable and shouldn't be taught. Other people have just left it out because they don't like the idea of that Scotland was involved in this slavery. You also have a situation whereby a lot of the teachers are completely ignorant of this history themselves because they weren't taught it. So we've had an attitude throughout the whole country since slavery was abolished or before. And therefore that must change. And the Scottish government has just set up a galleries committee. So the government is starting to do something. The council I was speaking to earlier before I joined you has set up a committee, and we are going to look at this history. The Scottish government set up a galleries museum steering group, and they want to be advised on the histories in our museum and how we can make them functional in terms of our education system. So the government has finally recognized it's at government level for the first time. And I think the changes will come. You know, for example, Glasgow University actually looked at their history, came up with the truth and said they earn about 200 million and that they're going to set up scholarship links with the Caribbean and with the Black community in Britain. The Heriot Watt has just worked a scholarship with the Royal Bank and NatWest Bank, and they're going to fund a scholarship for a BAME student. So a lot of things are happening. People are looking at museums. They're looking at their institutions, their buildings. They're looking at their companies. And we just hope that at the end of this, we will get a significant change where our representation within our society will be different and it won't be race-based.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're obviously an organisation campaigning for Scottish independence. And
Right.
a lot of the time the conversation is based around how we get independence or that we should all want independence. But at the same time, we often talk about what country we want to be. And how our organization, for example, we're very much, we always say we want an inclusive Scotland, we want a truly equal Scotland. And so I think it's really important that we have these conversations about the past and how we actually got to where we are right now, but also where we want to be once we're in independent Scotland. What questions do you think society should ask itself before becoming independent or starting an independent process? What do you think is like really the core questions we should ask each other of what country we want to be?
If you want to be, independent, as you said, and you've got every right to want that, it's not for me to not tell you that. The point is that if you look at many of our councils, and if you look at our parliament, the ethnic minority, but BAME representation in our governments are poor. They do not reflect the BAME population in the country. And that is something which, the politicians will have to try and redress. It's difficult if people are not going to vote for BAME people. But we also have a situation where some BAME people don't want to take part. And therefore, if people don't want to take part, it means that they don't feel that they want to be a part of a system of governance. And thus, one of the first things about our independence, I think, that we should start thinking about, how are we going to get a fair representation across our country so that the people within it can feel they're taking part in the governance of the country they live in.
Great, thank you. I'll just have a quick look at the chat. We've got a question from Benjamin Carey. Benjamin, do you want to come in yourself and ask your question? If I can find you. Sorry. If not, I can just read it out.
Yes, I can. Geoff, my question was, your personal experience to show that there clearly is still a lot of racism in Scottish society. The government is doing some genuinely good initiatives and also local authorities, but what do you think is going to change society? Because it's all very well the public sector doing interesting, useful things, but what is going to change attitudes amongst us? Well,
Benjamin, you've been in, I've not known you for years, but since the time I have, and it's been, since George Floyd. Yeah. And the point is that you've spoken out and you've been involved or make yourself involved. And the point is that, the ordinary person, as I say, can speak out, can in fact, no matter what their connections are, decide I don't want to be a part of that. I'm going to speak out and defend this change. And I think that people are still fearful of doing that. They feel they're a part of a gang of which they're not supposed to speak out. And I think that is wrong. And I will tell you of one example, and it was before the George Floyd situation. And I spoke to a large group of people yesterday, and I could sense, this difficulty of how are we going to get better representation from the powers that be. Because black people apply, or Asians apply for positions, and they get to the final stage of the interview and they get rejected. And what I said, it's for the management of the company to set up structures to ensure that that doesn't happen. Because if these people are in the company, they're qualified, they're able. The point is that there are nuances of interviews and expectations. And in my little book, I call it system consciousness. Is how do you give people system consciousness so that they can negotiate the system? Because the system has these little nuances which are used to reject people. And companies know that, and they must deal with it. And I did some work with the NHS, Edinburgh and the Lothians. And they realized that they had only 4 BAME managers, 4, when you consider the size of the nursing staff. Very highly qualified, but 4 managers. And the course was set up, a training course designed to deal with aspects like interview failure. And I gave some lectures on that course, and other people, even the BME people, didn't trust it at first. There was a lady, you know, called Mrs. Suleiman, that's right, who was involved as a nurse, black nurse, on that course, Mrs. Suleiman. Now, within 3 years, less than 3 years, because of that course, we've now got over 25 managers from the BAME community. That's what needs to be done. It has to recognize the problem and be honest in terms of solving that problem. I'll give you one example. One young man was wearing a particular kind of linen suit for his interview. He was a great nurse, but because he was wearing the wrong kind of clothes for this interview, he was rejected. And I had a word with him and I pointed that out. I said, okay, if you're on a plane, you know, and the pilot comes in smoking a fag in slippers and wearing a t-shirt and said, I can't fly, and the door is open, would you stay in? And he said, no, I wouldn't. I said, that's what they're saying. No problem since. The point is that it is what I call a Eurocentric society. Is keeping it Eurocentric with people who are from different backgrounds. And this is poor white people who don't understand the nuances of rich white people or middle-class white people. And therefore we need to use education to get rid of those prejudices, some of them racial, some of them are class. And that's where I feel that we need to do. And people like you, Benjamin, who have spoken out, and like the principal of Edinburgh, the vice principal, who actually saw that article in the Herald on Sunday and spoke out. And I think that will change. A lot of Black people have seen that. So let's do what we need to do to remove this Eurocentric aspect of our society that actually discriminates.
Thank you. And Julie, also what you've been talking about all along, that actually Scotland isn't just as Eurocentric as we think. There's always been people from other cultures and Black people who have contributed to this country, but we seem to remember it the way that it's taught at the moment as a very specific way. So actually, one of the questions that came up from Leah Gunn-Barrett is, Nina Monday asked before, do you think within the debate of Black Lives Matter, we could also talk about the horrible legacies of colonialism?
Well, yes. I mean, the legacies of colonialism. A lot of that is slavery. You know, you had 800,000 slaves in the Caribbean. You know, covering most of the Caribbean islands in terms of population for one country. Of course, you've got India and you've got other parts of the world where Britain has colonies. At one time, I think Britain was managing 1/5 of the world. So, you know, colonialism is there, it's spread all over the world. And I think we should address the consequences of that. It is not just about slavery. I'm talking about slavery because it is the Black population in the New World, you know, which I've described as the most profitable evil the world has known, where human beings were bought and sold for hundreds of years. And that is not, you know, it is colonialism, but with an addition to it, which must be accepted.
Thank you. Leah, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Professor. Really wonderful work that you're doing. I think as you're correct that education really is the key. And I grew up in the United States, you can probably tell from my accent, in the 60s and 70s, and there was really nothing about the genocide we committed against the American Indians. Certainly slavery, peonage, a lot of these things were just not taught. So I think really we're talking, to change attitudes, you have to start with educating young people. So how can we ensure that the history of Scotland's involvement in the slave trade is a part of the Scottish education curriculum? The school kids actually learn this history.
Well, we had a meeting last night with Edinburgh and Lothian, Edinburgh and Lothian Regional Equality Council, and I've made that point, that how can we get the government or the politicians who manage our educational system to get them to put this in as a mainstream option, not just nice to do, as they say in the north of Scotland. We don't want it as nice to do so the teacher can do it if they like, and they cannot do it if they don't like. The fact is it must be there like maths, physics and chemistry, because it's there to change attitudes and to educate. Now, the point is that what we agreed last night was that LREP will write a letter to the education minister and copy it to the first minister, because somehow still people are afraid to put, whether it's the history of the Red Indians in America or the Black people in Britain or elsewhere, it frightens them, the word Black slavery. It is because it was horrific. It was, a person, human being, was legally had no right to life and was property. Nobody said that about any other race, ever. That was the law. And therefore, this is where we're coming from, and people have dodged it and not addressed it. And it ended up with George Floyd. And therefore, we must all, if we have links with our MPs and our councillors and whatever, that's one way of starting this movement. To say to the MP and your councillors, we think this change is important, and how can it be effected?
I think that's a good action point for us all to take away and work on. And we just have a look at the questions. Heather, yeah, do you want to come in?
Hi, just about that. Scots don't really know their own history. I mean, history is taught within the context of the UK. And I would very much doubt that there's a lot of Scots actually even are even aware that Scottish people were involved in slavery, because when history is taught, it's taught as the Great British Empire. So people in Scotland tend to think of slave owners as being English rather than Scots. And I think the whole thing is, I'm talking as a teacher. When I was teaching history to primary children, it would be things like, Mary Queen of Scots, William Wallace, just that sort of thing. But and then when we went to secondary school, in secondary school, it's the Industrial Revolution. You'd think the Industrial Revolution never even touched Scotland. It all happened down in England. Everything happened down in England. You get taught about the Victorians and everything. You're never taught about your own country and your own countrymen's responsibilities and what they did over the years. So I'm not surprised that people don't know about Scots' involvement in slavery, because everything's taught within the prism of the UK. I mean, I didn't myself realise that there were slave owners in Scotland until more recently, and that's because I thought it was all the slave owners were all English, because it was English history that was taught to me when I was at school. And I think we've got to start teaching Scottish history if we're going to actually bring all these elements in. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I've even had a Black person on a program recently, and she was always referring to the English slave owners That's a black person.
Exactly.
You know?
I mean, it's horrendous. And I think we tend, you know, as far as America is concerned, I think they tend to bury all the bad parts of their histories and portray themselves as the goodies. You know, the Indians are all the baddies in all the movies and everything like that. You know, people want to portray themselves as, you know, the good guys. And I think that's part of, you know, part of the problem.
Oh, thank you very much. That's absolutely clear. And this is something we must try and change, in a sense definitely. That it is, and it is interesting for many Caribbean people because they're Scottish descent.
Yes, yes.
Whether genetics or through names, and a lot of us it's genetics.
I have an African American friend, and her name's Macklemore, and she said, you know, I probably descended from some Scots slave owner, you know, in her heritage, you know, because she's got a Scottish name.
You can tell from our skin color.
Yeah.
You know that we didn't take this skin color from Africa.
No, exactly.
And therefore it is there, it's obvious. It's just that we try so hard to deny this.
Yeah.
And historians are saying we can't teach them that. One historian actually told me that he wouldn't. He wrote a book, and because he felt and moderated it because he didn't think the Scots could take their history.
Yeah, I mean, Clara said earlier, you know, that when she was at school, that she learned about the Nazis and whatever. I think that you have to own your history, and by that you have to own the bad parts as well as the good parts.
That's right. Thank you.
You have to take responsibility.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got another question from Norman as well. Norman, I'll just ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi. I'm torn with lots of bits and pieces of questions as a result of your talk,
no problem.
Professor Palmer. And I have a question which I submitted, which I'll come to in a second. But see, when you started off explaining about your DNA, I'm afraid I've had my DNA done as well.
Yes.
And I look white, don't I?
Uh-huh.
But in actual fact, there's a woman buried in the southern necropolis in Glasgow, where I live. And she is mixed race, and she's my great-great-great-grandmother. And she's
Wonderful.
my direct female ancestor. So you'll know from DNA testing, Professor Palmer, that you can track your direct female ancestry.
Yes, very much so.
So I know for a fact that her mtDNA, which is my mtDNA, it's sub-Saharan African.
Right.
No ifs or buts. I've had it tested by different companies, and it's all come back to the same thing. You were tracing some of your ancestry to various West African countries.
Yes.
From a group that I'm in touch with in America. They're saying that the nearest match for our subgroup of this particular the Black African lineage, the nearest match at the moment is in Burkina Faso or Niger, which is a bit of a revelation for some of my extremely white relatives descended from the same person. The story, however, about this particular person, where she's buried is not quite lost. There's layer numbers and so on, but you can't find her because the vandalism in the southern necropolis, if you've ever been there, is extreme.
Oh yes, I know.
And I've no idea what kind of memorial would have been there, but since her son-in-law was a bank clerk, I think he would have raised some money for it. But it's obviously long gone. But see, this lady, there is a portrait of her. I have it somewhere in the house, but I didn't think I would be talking about this. You can tell, if you're an honest person, you can tell she's mixed race. She's not 100% European. You're kidding.
Yes,
it's obvious.
Right.
But her white descendants invented a story.
Right.
Not as much to deny that she was black, but to just blank out the possibility. And it's like a fairy tale. And it's completely it's not 100% false. It's built on some facts, but see, the attempt to deny it is ridiculous. But most of their descendants now know otherwise, because I sent them DNA results. But the interesting thing is, this is a young lady, as she is in the portrait I've got, which was when she married in Willemstad, Curaçao in 1813. Mm-hmm. She married a Gaelic-speaking army officer in the British Army of Occupation, and this was during the Napoleonic Wars. Right. And he took her back, in the end of the day, to the Western Isles of Scotland, to an island that's now uninhabited, with totally Gaelic-speaking. Their only child, their daughter, grew up speaking the Gaelic language to age 18. And when her husband died rather young, she had to claim the war pension. She had to go to a garrison in Glasgow to prove her identity and so on. And that's how she lived out the last days of her life in Glasgow. And how I come to be here, because I'm a Glaswegian, right? So I'm part of this whole damn empire thing. Not just the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Dutch slave trade, Mm-hmm. But on another side, and this is maybe more pertinent to our discussion just now, I'm also related to a slave trader, a Scottish slave trader from Ochiltree in Ayrshire, nice little conservation village, you wouldn't think it, in South Africa, in Cape Town. And his last deal I found on the internet was for 500 people. Right. My great Uncle Sandy, 500 people, right? And this deal was like a conspiracy between three Scotsmen at the Cape. In 1807, after the Act had already been passed in London, abolishing the slave trade into British colonies. And it was just a absolutely sleek it, conniving deal. And I've waved kind of way. I'm proud of this connection at the same time as finding it utterly abhorrent. You can't deny who you are. And I'm sure that must apply to Afro-Caribbean and Afro-American people a lot. Yes. That if they know that they're also descended from the slave owner or a slave driver or some damn white person, you can't cut that out of your DNA. Absolutely not. You can't, what do? Cut a leg off? I mean, you can't do that. So although I'm not descended from this slave owner, the slave trader, I can't shrug off the connection. And you were talking about the people who claim compensation. This man had died long before that came about, but two of his children, who would be my first cousins 4 times removed, claimed compensation for slavery, all the way from Cape Town. But they didn't have many at that point that looked like household servants or anything else. But they had the nerve to claim compensation. But there's many other aspects in which Scotland has been villainous, quite frankly, in the empire. And there were Gaelic-speaking immigrants in Gippsland, in what's now the state of Victoria in Australia, who massacred Aborigines. Mm-hmm. And led by an Angus MacMillan from Mull. And they called themselves the Highland Brigade. Isn't that great? I bet they had a Union Jack and a saltire. And they had rifles. And the Aborigines had throwing spears. And at a place called Warrigal Creek. The date is not in my mind, but it's in a wee article I wrote I was asked to write an article long years ago in the 1990 or thereabouts by the anti-apartheid people in Glasgow for a book that was being presented to Nelson Mandela when he came to Glasgow.
Norman, I think...
Sorry, I'll get around to the question.
Yes.
Okay,
no, it's all right.
The details about Warrigal Creek are in there. My question, and it's a question that's been in my head since the 1980s, and there's never been a place for it till now. Apologies for the poetic nature of it. It came from a particular experience. Will the redeeming rain of independence wash away the stain of empire?
I would answer that by, the first statement which was made. We cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences. And whether it's an independent or a non-independent Scotland, then Scotland is a country. We're all standing on it. It doesn't change. And therefore, what we've got to do is to take the responsibility of, there is something, a lot of Jamaicans are brought up with the Bible. I had to go to church 3 times every Sunday, and I could not go unless I was sick. And that's a Scottish thing. And one of the things I learned at Sunday school was that, there's something called the sins of the father. And that's why I use the concept of consequences. The point is that a decent human beings are about looking at the consequences of the past. And I think whether Scotland is independent or not, then in fact, that's a responsibility that people living in Scotland have.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is a really important point, because although we can talk about what country we want to be once we're independent, the reality is that for many people there are still inequalities that matter to them right now, if we're independent or not. And you said before, there's a few actions that we can take in order to help elevate the people in society that are currently discriminated towards, or that are suffering from institutional racism. So we all can, after we finish this call, we can all write our MPs today and say that we want to ensure that the education curriculum actually has Black history on it, and that we get taught these things. And we don't need to wait for an independent Scotland for making that happen. So I'm sure we all have a few things that we can do later on. Just to check, we've got 7 o'clock now. I think I'm going to take a few more questions before we finish off. I know a lot of times around 7 people turn off because they want to go and have their teas. But I think we'll take a few more questions, just because we just want to make the most of having you here tonight.
Thank you.
It's just really great. One question actually I wanted to ask as well was that the Beneva Centre for Slavery Studies launched 2 days ago in Glasgow. And I was wondering if you could give a bit more information around the Beneva Centre, if you have any, and whether you think that having these sort of institutions that are opening up now and teaching us more about the past, whether that will lead to having a more insightful society.
Well, I think that a centre which has a specific remit for doing that is a good thing. But what I'm worried about is that it doesn't take on what we've had before, this academic leanings in one way or the other. The point is that what I've tried to do is to link the history with what people can see. Mm-hmm. So if you've got the Gallery of Modern Art, we can do a great history about that. We can catalogue its beginning from 1778 right to today. But if in fact we don't say that slavery allowed somebody, because of their slaves, to build that, and he built it with so much money, and therefore there is a link between that building and the circumstances that produced it, and therefore that justifies us doing something. The point is that, Michael Fry, the historian, actually says, and we don't want that from any more research. We've had masses of research that has led us to the situation where Michael Fry in the papers last year, the Times said, this is the past, and the standards of morality then are different from now. This is what he's trying to say. And therefore, Enri Dundas was a really powerful character, but, that's how powerful we were. And we did bad things, but so what? We had a big gun, so we did it. My attitude is that, as I said before, that evil is evil. And modern times doesn't change that. It is insulting to people of the past to say that they had less intelligence, less capacity, less feelings, less humanity because it was the past. It's absolutely nonsense. A lot of what we do today are based on the values of the past. You know, we still, recognize and accept thou shalt not kill. We don't say that was the past, and therefore those values don't apply anymore, so we can kill anybody we like.
Yeah.
It's nonsense. So centers must be careful of the academic nuances, and they must, in fact, relate that history to the human beings and the circumstances of those human beings today.
In your book, The Enlightenment, you actually dedicated it to Reverend Robert Wedderburn.
Yes.
Who was a Black person who basically got written out of history and abandoned from his family. And I think when we talk about the past, and a lot of times people say, oh, well, it's just the past, doesn't matter. But we've got a large population, or we've got population in Scotland that are Black, that do not know any Black historic figures, and that, systematically had people written out of history. So what do you think, how do you think that impacts young Black people when they don't see any representation in the history when there was clearly people there?
I think that, when I was a boy in London, and I was brought up probably differently from these, say, like my children, who are very much aware of, their history and attitudes and whatever. I was brought up like my mother. We had no idea about Black history. We were just poor people who migrated to London in the 50s. That's when I arrived, 1955. And we just lived and tried to make a living. I only became politically active when my wife brought home once, as a psychologist, a list. And she was a psychologist in Crawley. And she brought home a list with ranking the educational capacities of different races. And Afro-Caribbeans were at the bottom. And I wrote my first article, the Times Educational Supplement, pointing out that that list was based on falsehoods. And therefore white teachers were saying Black parents had unrealistic expectations of their children, unrealistic expectations. It meant that you are slave derived, you haven't got brain in your head, and therefore you can't expect your children to go to college and university. And that's where we've come from. And therefore, what I'm hoping is that Black kids are much more aware of their history. But I don't want it to be a palliative. We're going to tell you something about your history that's too bad. It's got to be part of their education too. It's not got to be some sort of a weapon of complaint. It's got to be part of their education so they don't kill each other in London or elsewhere. And that's what the curriculum change must be. It's not, take down 2 statues. And every time you complain about racism, we'll take a statue down for you. My attitude is the 3rd statue that comes down should be racism. Black history isn't about, every little October you have a few meetings. I love the October focus. But Black history throughout the year must be about history that's part of the curriculum, part of our life changes in terms of for the better. And I don't want Black people to have this history to think they can use it as a weapon. It should be part of their argument.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we'll end it on that now. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us tonight, but more importantly, taking so much effort in your life. You're a very busy man, aside from your activism. So it's really, as I said before, I really respect you for the work that you're doing to educate all of us on the history that we don't know otherwise, and we haven't learned otherwise. So thank you very much. I think we all know what to do today is to write to our MPs and also put a word in that we need Black history in the curriculum. And so everyone keep an eye out for LREC's letter so we can write in support as well, or just write anyways. So yeah, thank very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to do our fundraising bit as always. So if you'd like to support our work so that we can keep this conversation going, please feel free to give us some money. If you can't give any money, if you share our social media posts, share them with your friends, invite other people to those meetings, that's also much appreciated. But yeah, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you very much for asking me, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.